We appreciate you joining us. On this week's episode, we're going to be looking at the topic of drunkenness. Is drunkenness sinful? If it is sinful, why is it sinful? It seems like such an easy question, yet so many people have real trouble with it. Let's see what the Bible has to say on this week's episode of Ears to Hear. Thank you for joining us.
Be still, my soul, the Lord is on my side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Lead to thy God to order and provide. In every change, He faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, night rest thy heavenly friend. Through thorny ways, lead to thy joyful end.
Again, we appreciate you joining us this week. Andrew, how are you doing?
John, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So we're talking about drunkenness. I mentioned to you beforehand, I don't usually like talking about topics like this. It's just, for me, it's kind of cut and dry. And I think maybe one of the reasons I don't like talking about it is I've never really been tempted by it. Honestly. So it's kind of a non-issue for me. But I do know it's an issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, it at least is a topic that it conjures a lot of what about questions or what if questions.
Yeah.
You know, it's an easy one to come up with very, very specific scenarios to try to lean one way or the other.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, in culturally speaking, it is a much bigger problem.
Oh, culturally speaking, it's ubiquitous. I mean, in modern culture and throughout all known ancient history, you know, alcohol and humanity has pretty much gone hand in hand as long as we have recorded knowledge of
Man, you're going back
humankind.
millennium. I was just talking about how many alcohol stores we have in Columbus that we are surrounded by. It is a problem. Let's just put it like that.
It's nothing new, and there's no shortage of you know, passages that talk about it
Yeah.
as well.
It's always been a problem going, like you said, going back forever. And I just wanted to talk about it. So to get into it, and I thought we might kind of address it, at least to start out with, by some of the excuses people use for drunkenness. And I think anytime you're talking to someone about this issue, immediately they go to, well, Jesus turned the water to wine. So I thought we might just start there. That account is found in John chapter 2. So in John chapter 2, Jesus and his disciples, they're at a wedding feast, and they ran out of wine. The mother of Jesus said to them, they have no wine, and you have the miracle that's happening. And as it happens, in verse 9, when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, so obviously that means we can all be engaged in drunken debauchery. That's, you know, and it's the go-to verse that
Sure.
very often, especially younger people, Jesus turned the water to wine, so it's okay for me to drink then. And just a few topics, or a few issues. One, there was no word for, you know, if you go down the aisle at Walmart or Kroger, and you have the alcoholic wine and you have the sparkling, you have the non-alcoholic. Well, they did not have different words for what was just grape juice and what was not grape juice. It was just wine. That's one thing. We do need to recognize in this situation, they were Jews. And the Jews believed, because it was part of the old law, that drunkenness was sinful. So to argue that Jesus was engaged in sinful behavior and was actually enabling sinful behavior, and that they were actually even more sinful after Jesus turned the water to wine, it's just frankly ridiculous. That's just not what's going on. And to just look at the character of Jesus. At one point, what's the word that they're going to call him, Andrew?
Well, there will be times...
And it's going to be based on this, actually, because John the Baptist has already showed up on the scene. He's already been teaching, and people have been following him, and they all think he has a demon.
Right, because what Jesus would say about the Jews' view was, okay, John came to you, he wasn't eating and drinking, the way you do, and you said
he's out in the wilderness, he's eating wild honey and locusts, and
Jesus' words about that was, you say he's a madman,
he's got a demon. Yeah,
and the Son of Man, talking about himself, he said he comes eating and drinking, and you say, look, he's a winebibber, he's a drunkard. Right. So Jesus himself was accused of the same kind of thing, just by the fact that he, I think clearly from that, did drink the wine that he was either making or that they had commonly at the time. I guess to the point of that, at least from what I understand, in those days, just any beverage from the juice of grapes, right, the way it was stored, the way it was made, it was all just wine, right, to them. You already mentioned that. They didn't have the no pulp Welch's, pure, stuff that we have in the grocery store that's just juice. Right.
And you can tell in other passages, where it differentiates between wine and strong drink. Right. And you can show there's a difference there.
There seemingly was a difference.
Just from the language that's used.
What may have been referred to as strong drink, we'd probably consider something more like a vinegar or a more intentionally fermented drink.
Right.
But I think also the wine that they had, any excessive consumption of it would still result in drunkenness. But that's the thing I was getting at was, it seems that from our understanding of history, it would take much more excessive consumption to be noticeably drunk from the kind of wine that they had at the time.
And let me ask it this way, because the accusation made against Jesus was that he was a wine bibber.
Right.
And so we simply ask, was he a wine bibber?
No.
And it's like, no, that's not what's going on here.
Yeah, Jesus at no point was uncontrolled in his consumption or was gluttonous. With food, when he was making food and feeding people around him, it wasn't in excess. It wasn't to, stuff them full so that they just couldn't eat another bite. It was, we needed a meal, and he provided it.
And I would say when people come to John chapter 2 to try to justify drinking, frankly, on almost any level, if you're going to use John 2 to justify drinking on any level, you're missing the point of John chapter 2. The whole point of the miracle is not Jesus's discourse on whether drinking alcohol is appropriate or not appropriate. That's really not the point of the miracle.
It's certainly not the lesson
in any shape or form.
And we know this because the very miracle itself, Jesus didn't really want it to be known that it was a miracle. It was before he had really gained a following, or people really knew about him very much, and it was before his time to really reveal himself.
And obviously people did find out about it just from the verse that you mentioned a minute ago, the accusation that was made against him. But to look at the miracle, there is a point to the miracle, and it's not a justification for what most people think. So that's the first thing. Okay, so the second justification people use is, well, it's natural. How would you deal with that question? It's natural. Just for me, because people will use that same argument with other things. I've heard people use it, and we'll just say, not all nature was ever meant to be consumed. Just because something is natural, that doesn't, frankly, it doesn't give you the right to abuse it at all.
Sure.
But also, just because something is natural doesn't mean, I've heard this argument used with marijuana, frankly. Mm-hmm. And it's like, listen, just because you can smoke it doesn't mean you should smoke it. Just because something is a plant doesn't mean that you have to consume it.
Right.
So
I mean,
just because it's natural, that's not a good reason.
Yeah.
But also the things that people do with alcohol, frankly, it's not natural.
well, certainly with the
distillery and things like that.
with the advent of new technologies, the technology of alcohol production is far different than it was when the Bible was written. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing too I was thinking about was, you have examples throughout Scripture where, whether it was just the law of God that was given, like in the Old Testament, you have prohibitions on certain foods, and that was done away with when the Old Testament was fulfilled. For example, eating the meat from pigs or eating certain shellfish or seafood.
We're not talking about bacon, Andrew. Don't you dare tell me I can't eat my bacon.
We're not talking about bacon, but the idea there is just, those things were equally as natural. The Gentiles who were eating pigs right and left, just as natural. Nothing wrong from an external perspective of eating pork, and yet, some things were different because it was the basis of God's law. Other things in the Bible can be an issue even if it's not something that's prohibited on the basis of God's law. I'm thinking about, the idea of gluttony or excess. The excessive intake of sugar. I mean, you can look at a modern diet and say, the excessive intake of sugar is anything but natural. And the problems that can result from that too can be a problem in and of itself. So I think the two things wrapped up in there are, even if it's natural, it can be against the law of God, using, the Old Testament as an example. Not saying the Old Testament specific examples are binding today, or just the principle of excess, lack of control, those kind of things. Even something that's natural can become an issue. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's profitable.
Yeah, and we will say this: things are not sinful. Things are not sinful, right? It's what we do with things.
Sure.
One of the verses that I had on my list, when Jesus talks about not that which goes into a man, and it's Matthew 15 at verse 11, not that which goes into a man defiles him, but it's that which comes out. Now, does that mean we can consume anything we want to? No, you somewhat have to start looking at motives, for one thing. You have to start looking at what's in a person's heart.
Mm-hmm. And
we might come back to that idea. But, that verse, and there's a verse in Colossians that talks about, don't be, when you're dealing with do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, and all those things concern the law. It's talking about the dietary laws of Judaism. So it's when people look at those verses, okay, so now everything goes, right? And it's, things are not sinful. And as you were talking about that, and hopefully this doesn't go off in a whole different direction. When it talks about Gentiles who by nature keep the things of the law, and it uses that idea.
Right.
Now, does that mean that those Gentiles were not eating bacon? No, I think they weren't keeping the dietary laws.
Yeah.
We're talking about other things. I think that concept of not that which goes into a man defiles a man. When Jesus said that, the old law was still in effect.
Right.
And yet it was still true. It's not that which goes into a man. That is not what defiles him. It's what comes out.
Right. And maybe the understanding there is that those dietary laws in the Old Covenant, they were never on the basis of
food bad.
Right. They weren't on the basis of protecting them from something that was bad for them. If we're talking about, pork or shellfish, that wasn't the point. I know I've heard people talk about, maybe if you didn't cook them right, there were more risks associated with some foods. It's not the point. Because then later when
suddenly at 33 AD,
later when Peter sees the sheet come down and there's all manner of unclean creatures, and the idea
Rise,
is,
Peter, kill and eat, but cook it in a certain way that will alleviate all issues
the right FDA temperature to keep each of those animals at. Was
exactly.
Also let down in a separate sheet. I forget what my point was.
That food in and of itself is not bad.
Yeah.
Food in and of itself is not sinful. It's what comes out of a man that defiles him. So, but concerning the argument, well, it's natural. we just need to think a little more deeply about it. On my list of things to consider concerning drunkenness, like we said, it's always been an issue. Just looking back at the Old Testament, Noah gets off the ark, plants a vineyard, and he becomes drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not good what happens to him. Lot, when he flees Sodom and Gomorrah, and his daughters make him drunk and lie with him. So, to that idea, whether we're talking about Noah or Lot, I think the question is, what's really the problem? That's really why I wanted to talk about this.
Right.
I mean, it's a beverage.
Yeah.
So what's really the problem?
It seems innocent enough. I think in both of those examples, there's a common thing that is clear from the way the story goes, which is in the case of Noah and Lot and others who, it's talked about them becoming drunk. There's the loss of their own faculties. I mean, it says that Lot, when he was, once he was drunk, he didn't know what was going on. He was he was totally out of it.
Yeah.
Noah, the same thing. He was in a state where he just wasn't in control of himself. So clearly that is an issue that's brought up in Scripture. That's never something that's spoken of favorably. There's other characters in the Bible who drink wine and they still remain in control of their actions, and they still, they show no signs of being being changed in their nature. So I would say one of the first things that we have to look at is it about a lack of control, or is it about, losing oneself or medicating oneself to the point of stupor?
And we will say to that point, and the one that you're thinking of, and I know just because we talked about it before, in Uriah, and it says that David effectively got him drunk, but Uriah still did not go back and lay with Bathsheba. He didn't go back to his wife.
He considered it his duty to still, to still be loyal to the king.
But there's an element there. What was David trying to do?
David was trying to get Uriah's judgment to be impaired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So David knew what was possible. It just so happens Uriah was able to keep his wits about him to the point where he did not go back.
Right. Actually, the one I was thinking of that we also mentioned was Boaz in Ruth 3, where it talks about how he drank and was merry in his heart, and then he went to sleep. Ruth comes in and lies at his feet, and then when Boaz wakes up, he still has the presence of mind. He realizes who she is. He realizes, that, in order to be proper about her and their relationship, he's gonna work it out with the next of kin. But Boaz is viewed as an honorable and favorable character in that story. He does what's right, and he doesn't sin.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look in Galatians and look at some of the main passages. This is Galatians as it talks about the works of the flesh in contrast with the fruit of the Spirit. And this is Galatians 5. The works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. But then the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. So we see drunkenness as a work of the flesh. And when we really think, what's the problem? And it's one of the problems you've already touched on, it's self-control.
Yeah. And it's contrasted with self-control in that passage.
Right. That the Lord wants us to walk circumspectly, mm-hmm. and to be disciplined. And drunkenness removes that discipline. And I think you would have to say, and I don't think there's any argument, the more drunk you are, the less discipline you have.
Right.
Would you say that's fair to say?
Definitely. Once you start to lose your discipline, it does become a snowballing problem. Yeah, go ahead.
So that's one of the passages that very clearly shows it. And to this point, and How did you want to share your thoughts on this, Andrew, or do you want to?
I think we're kind of getting into it too.
Talk about the line, in the sand that people draw.
Okay. So one of the things I had in my notes, and something that I've thought about this question before, is, is it a matter of absolute teetotalism, absolute abstinence, or is there room for limited drinking with self-control? And something that I've thought about before, this is the way I've heard a lot of things talked about. Seemingly, it's a pretty common view in the church. We tend to kind of, when it comes to substances,
right?
And we kind of put them, things, we've talked about that already, things you can consume.
Right.
We tend to put them on a spectrum,
right.
And on one end of the spectrum, you'd have crack cocaine and black tar heroin. And then on the middle of the spectrum, maybe you've got your marijuana, and maybe you have your alcohol and your tobacco there somewhere. And then on the other side of the spectrum, maybe you have caffeine and sugar and carbohydrates, so. And then it's almost like the mentality is, okay, pick where you're going to draw the line, and what's on the good side of the line and what's on the bad side of the line. And people draw that line in different places. There's people in the Christian community who, in the modern religious Christian community, who say drinking's okay. They draw the line, to the right side of alcohol.
Right.
Or maybe they'll say tobacco and marijuana and alcohol, that's okay. We know that the Mormons, they draw the line on the other side of caffeine. They abstain from any caffeinated substances. So to me, when I looked at that problem, and I look at the inconsistency of, okay, pick what's on the good list and what's on the bad list. Well, anything that's on that list can be abused. We've already talked about how, sugar and fat can be as much a self-control issue.
Lights up the same parts of the brain as
Sure.
drugs.
Sure. And the
You can
Bible
be
talks
addicted. You can be addicted.
Bible talks about gluttony. It talks about, those who, the king's rich morsels, the rich foods of the king, and how, Daniel abstained from that. Again, not saying that meat or desserts are inherently sinful, but
right.
It's about excess. It's about control. So I've always kind of held the view, rather, that instead of saying it's a black and white stark line that you pick one substance or another to draw the line on, it's what do you enslave yourself to? What is a problem for you? And I don't want to make it seem like, it's okay if you think you can handle it, give heroin a try. No, there's obviously things where your level of risk is far, far greater for certain things. So you definitely would want to be careful.
Yeah, and go ahead and reference the Romans passage that.
Yeah, well, all of this kind of mentality, I guess I look at Romans 6 as kind of being the basis for it. And there in Romans 6, it talks about...
Yeah, Paul uses the figure of slave.
Right, he
of
uses
being
the
a slave.
idea of slaves. And, he talks about, in verse 12, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law but under grace." And he says, what then? Are we to sin because we're not under law but under grace? By no means. "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?" So, it's a matter of what will we let ourselves be controlled by? And if we let ourselves be controlled by our desires, and we're just not going to hold anything back from ourselves, we're not going to, like Solomon said, anything that I wanted, right, I didn't withhold from myself. If we do that, then we're letting our desires take the reins. We're letting our desires be our master. And so we're slaves to that. And by that extension, slaves to sin. So it takes a conscious decision to say, no, I'm going to be slaves to righteousness. I'm going to present myself to God as a servant for his righteousness. And that takes control, and that takes, knowing oneself and knowing what are someone's triggers, what are someone's temptations. like you said at the beginning, you said that you've never really been tempted by alcohol.
Right.
I put myself in the same boat. I've never had an issue with it, never tried it, and so by that idea, it's never really been an issue for me. But for those who know that it's an issue, certainly don't present yourselves as slaves to those desires.
And I will say, some things, and I'm not disagreeing with, food can be addictive,
mm-hmm.
but we do have to eat.
Right.
So there is a difference between the two, but it still can be addictive. And if we are beholden to it, if we're enslaved to it, then it's just as sinful.
Right.
With this topic, what are you enslaved to? Are you a slave to righteousness? And we're back to, it's not that which goes into a man that defiles him, it's what comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what is coming out? Right. What is in your heart? What is in your mind? What are you thinking about? And there's a passage in Ephesians where it says, this is Ephesians 5, verse 15, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. At any, checkpoint, sobriety checkpoint, and they make you walk the line. And if you're drunk, guess what you have trouble doing? You're not going to be able to walk circumspectly. And no, I know this isn't talking about a sobriety checkpoint, but we're talking about self-control. We're talking about understanding what the will of God is.
Right.
Verse 17, therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. It's not that which goes into a man that defiles him, it's that which comes out.
Right. And that same idea is also in the Romans 6 passage later on. I didn't read that far, but it talks about how he says in verse 20, when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness, but what fruit were you getting at that time from the things of which you are now ashamed? So Paul's asking, what was the outcome of your actions when you were serving your own desires? Right. And the outcome, the fruits of that behavior, he says at the end of verse 21, the end of those things is death. So clearly, if we're off the chain, or just if we're out of control, then yes, the things that come out of us, the things that come out of a man, or the fruits of our actions, they're not positive. They're not helping us walk circumspectly. Because
that is the figure of the Galatians, the works of the flesh in contrast with the fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
It's about, what are you producing?
Right.
It's, okay, you're a slave to sin. What did that result in? Ultimately, it's going to be death.
Right. It's almost like when Paul would say, in Corinthians, that all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable.
Right.
What is the profit of one's drunkenness? If they wish to justify it, if they wish to cling to it, then what are you gaining by it that's actually helping you?
Yeah. This is Proverbs chapter 23. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of the eyes? Those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine. Do not look at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent, stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things. Your heart will utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or one who lies at the top of the mast, saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? What is your life like? And granted, the Romans passage, it's speaking more about spiritual death, being the wages of sin.
Right.
But at the same time, what is your life like going down this? You do not have any fruit unto righteousness.
Yeah, there's certainly physical consequences of alcohol that even someone who has no faith at all, plenty of people choose not to drink just because of the physical consequences and the health consequences. I mean, we understand that more now even than we used to.
And I mean, I hate to say it, but it's, full well that self-control comes into this. And full well you will lose your self-control, and you don't know at what point that is going to happen, but it's going to get worse and worse the further you go down that road. And it's dangerous. It's just dangerous. So, I think of Paul's words to Timothy when he says, flee youthful lusts. It's like, don't play around with youthful lusts. Don't, it's flirting with danger. Well, why are you flirting with it? It's going to end up getting you in the long run. Anyway, so this passage, and while we're talking about Timothy, let's come up to 1 Timothy. Oh, let's see, is it 1 Timothy or is it 2 Timothy, where Paul tells him, it must be 1 Timothy. This is 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23. 1 Timothy 5, verse 23, and this starts getting into the conclusionary remarks of the letter. But Paul tells Timothy, and this is one of the excuses that sometimes people use, and it's verse 23, no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. And for one thing, the amount of wine is given when he says drink a little wine. He doesn't say use it in excess. Mm-hmm. So the amount is given, but also the purpose is given for your stomach's sake and for your frequent infirmities. Most people think that Timothy probably had an ulcer, something along those lines, and that this is not a social thing. This is medicinal in this passage. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of grief, my notes are horrible this week, Andrew. The verse in Proverbs, it's Proverbs, oh good grief, now I have to actually read my notes. It's Proverbs 31 verse 6 that talks about give wine to a dying man. And that there is, when I read that verse, I just think of treating it as an anesthetic. Mm-hmm. That there is a medicinal purpose, if you will.
Right.
So anyway, my point is using those verses as a justification doesn't really work. I mean, just because that's not what those verses are about. But I think that the overall problem is what we're talking about with self-control. It's self-control, and it's, to look at some, you mentioned enslavement from Romans 6. Some of the other things we've spoken about, if you try to hide it, what does that say is going on in your mind?
Right. I mean, if you're trying to hide it, then in your own conscience, it would appear that you're not convinced in your own conscience.
And now we're back to Romans 14 because it's, do you have faith?
Right. So it seems that you are, you feel some guilt about it.
Right.
Or you're afraid about what other people are going to think about it. Right. But either way, you're not convinced in your conscience about your actions. You've got some lingering doubts. You don't feel right about it.
And here, in Romans, it's he who doubts is condemned if he eats because he does not eat from faith. Mm-hmm. And wherever you come down on this issue, and I will say it is not up to us to determine this issue. It is up to us to see what God's word says about it.
Right.
Just because someone says, well, I'm comfortable with it, well, that doesn't make it right necessarily. It doesn't make it wrong. It's what does God's word say about it? So just because a person says, yep, I can do it in faith because, whatever. Well, that doesn't necessarily make it so. But we do have to do things in faith. And if a person is hiding behavior, that's a pretty good sign. They have a guilty conscience and they're not doing it in faith. Mm-hmm. So at that point, it's already sinful. Even there, as it talks about it, we're talking about things that God has said, God has approved. But if you don't do it in faith, if you doubt and you violate your own conscience, then it is sinful.
Right.
So
there's another interesting point in Romans 14 as well, which maybe you were going to get to, but he says later too, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God.
Right.
Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is not good to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. So I would say by that passage as well, even if there is not a total prohibition on something, and even if you can in good conscience do something yourself, if you know that would that would harm the conscience of another who knows you,
Right.
and knows your actions, then you should forsake that liberty. You should not exercise your liberty to do so if you know that it would harm someone else. And to that point, I would say that's enough reason for me, knowing what I know about, many of the people that I'm familiar with and their views on the matter. Even if I felt in my conscience that, as long as I'm maintaining self-control, as long as I'm not doing it to get drunk, as long as I'm doing it, in full knowledge of myself and what my intentions are, even if I could feel good about that in my own conscience, I should still abstain, knowing the harm that it could do to another's conscience.
Yep, very much so. And I mean, being a Christian is about discipline and self-control and things like that. Some of the other issues, just in these few minutes we have, self-control, I think, is a big problem. Like I said, enslavement, what are you beholden to?
Right.
Dependency. It's like, what are you depending on?
Yeah.
Are you depending on alcohol to alleviate you of responsibility? Are you depending on alcohol to somehow deaden your senses to issues? And my point is, we're supposed to be leaning on the Lord. We should not be leaning on any substance, whether it's alcohol, whether it's food, whatever it is. It's like that should not be our crutch.
Right.
Our crutch should be the Lord.
And by that statement, we're not saying that one should forsake medicine if they're sick.
No.
It's a matter of, like you said, it's like if we become so used to it that we can't picture going without it.
Right.
When it's not a real need, it's a created need that we've made for ourselves.
Yeah. So that's one of the issues. Like I said, guilt. If there's any guilt associated with something, if you try to hide it, you've already got issues. My question would be, for an individual, why would you want to? And at that point, we're almost to the Ephesians passage. Do not be filled with wine, but be filled with Spirit. It's like, why would you want to? And my personal view is with the Timothy passage, when Paul tells Timothy, no longer drink only water, but drink a little wine for your stomach's sake. I think that shows Timothy was only drinking water. That he had, I know people will take the view, well, the water back then was so bad that everybody drank wine. All I know is Paul said, don't drink only water, but drink a little wine. So I think you can show from that Timothy had been abstaining, and you made the point off air, that the Nazirite vow,
right,
where they were specifically told.
It's always specified when somebody's a Nazirite that they
didn't drink
any,
right.
They didn't eat any grape product,
yeah,
and no strong drink. And the fact that that's specified
shows a possibility.
It points to the fact that was the exception.
Yeah. So then you have to get to, okay, so why did God command that? Why did he want the Nazirites to do that?
Well, I would point also to the not cutting the hair thing. Nobody's out here saying,
is this why you haven't been getting a haircut?
I cut my
hair.
Have
you taken a vow?
Within the last couple months. Good thing this is audio only.
That's right.
So people don't have to weigh in on this. What was I saying? Okay.
Nazirite vow.
Right. So if you point to the Nazirite vow as, they shouldn't have drank because drinking would have been sinful. Well, clearly for anyone else, cutting your hair isn't sinful, but yet the Nazirites also didn't cut their hair. I think the two...
So do you think there was something magical about the do not drink?
No. I think the two things.
Why did he tell them not to cut their hair?
Well, I don't know that, but the point was, it was we're going to be temperate in the matter of cutting hair and in the matter of what we consume or don't consume. All of it was about temperance and dedication to the reason the vow was made, which was some kind of service to God.
Yeah.
It was in service to God, in focusing and meditating on God's on what God would have them to do. So they use that kind of like fasting. We talk about prayer and
right.
fasting as abstaining to focus
right.
on other things.
That idea of temperance is brought up by Paul when he talks about that he disciplined his body, that he was temperate in all things. Anyway, so it's an interesting question. And I know people usually like to know, where is the line?
It would be great if the Bible just said, never drink, don't even think about it, don't even try it. But it doesn't say that. But what it does say is the principles around it.
Right.
What are the fruits of
right.
your actions when you serve your desires?
What are you desiring?
What is the function of it? What is it you want?
Right. What is coming out of you?
Sure. I mean, you could say the same thing about, why do you want to drink coffee? We could go down a rabbit hole of, again, it's the same.
We're going to bring the episode to a close on that.
It's the same rabbit hole you could go down of, well, why do you consume any product? Why do you consume any food or drink? It ought not to be because we just want to gratify ourselves.
Right.
If we're doing that with anything, then we ought to be more careful about it.
Yeah. Yep. Very much so. So it's hard to say the hard and fast line, but we will say a person has to be honest with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, why are you doing this? What are you looking for? Why? What's the danger? Are you wanting to do the will of God, or is this about your own desires? And it starts getting into more questions like that, frankly, rather than just talking about stuff, because it's still just stuff, and stuff inherently is not sinful. At the same time, stuff is also not inherently righteous. Stuff is neither.
Right.
These are just things. We have to look at our hearts and our minds, and what and what comes out of a man.
Sure.
You look like you have a thought. Go ahead, Andrew.
When you mention, I don't want to go off on another rabbit trail, but when you mentioned stuff, it just made me suddenly think about, there's been times in history and different religious movements where mirrors were banned because the idea of looking into a mirror was vanity, looking at yourself. And so it just made me think, a mirror isn't sinful.
Right.
But if you're self-obsessed, if you're vain, that the attitude around stuff and the attitude of what controls you and what you pursue, that's what's coming out of a man's heart. That's what defiles them.
Yep, very much so. So we'll go ahead and bring it to a close on that. Andrew, appreciate the study.
Appreciate you, John.
Yep, I hope everyone has a good week. Hope everyone has been doing well. We appreciate you joining us, and thank you very much for having ears to hear. We'll see you next week.
Be still,